Okay, we'll start at 2:30.
All right.
5:30 your time.
All right.
Did AOF get a, did they send any, did I ask you that already? Seems like maybe I asked you that already.
I pulled.
Sometimes I write emails and I don't know if I push the send button or not.
Right. I pulled their logo off the internet.
Oh, okay. Because they did send in $100.
Or I think actually maybe Ken sent the logo, but it's in the scrolling.
Okay.
It's in the waiting room currently.
Well, I'm not there because I don't want to get confused between Zoom and.
Right. Are you going to check? Are you going to just stay here on this format?
Yeah, I'll just mute myself. I mean, I'll just mute. I was told to do that last year, wasn't I? Isn't that what I did last year?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine. That'll work.
Just watch it from here.
Yeah.
And I suppose if I really want to see the logos and stuff, I can see the recording. Right?
True. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
There, what is?
Our
the
player.
pay-B screen.
Yeah, our interface. Yes. That's what it looks like right now.
Oh, I love that young picture. That makes me miss Bill Potts, although I don't know that, he loved that picture too.
Who was an incredibly handsome young man?
He married,
I
right?
just want to pat him on the head like a little puppy. Let's see. There it is. I got it.
There it is.
See where my papers are.
Doing a great job, Samuel. We appreciate it, buddy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it without
I feel
you.
more comfortable this year.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah. Yeah. Having done it once, and then also, then Samuel and I, we met again afterwards and went over stuff. And he's got it. He's doing us a big favor. We're lucky to have him. I can tell you that right now.
Well, I went on to get your, to get your Zoom link, and then I saw your scripts and stuff. So you put in a lot of work. Did you do it this morning like I did?
Mostly.
I do better under pressure.
I'm getting a call. Lady's not getting any information about the Zoom link.
Well, they may be confused by the fact you had your scripts and it's way down at the bottom. So
well, they should be getting a link from pay-B.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they should. Oh yeah, that link, the real link.
Hi, Patrick from Darwin Day, returning your call.
I got to turn my phone off.
You have not received an email from us?
Yesterday, I got one.
Patrick, I'm gonna start playing. Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
I think I got my event link yesterday. Is that possible?
Start to make sure everything's going. I'll bring.
Hello. Thank you for joining us today for the 25th annual Sacramento Darwin Day celebration. My name is Patrick Desmond, and it is my honor to serve as the chair of the Sacramento Darwin Day Organizing Committee. The committee is composed of a group of dedicated and passionate volunteers focused on promoting and supporting science in the greater Sacramento area. Each year, the group seeks out an exciting and compelling speaker who can further our enthusiasm and understanding for science. This year is no exception. Our speaker, Dr. Eric Naumann, is at the forefront of his field, and his presentation is, I think, you will find very timely and informative. As you may have heard me mention, this is our 25th anniversary of producing the Sacramento Darwin Day celebration. I've got a tech support screen on my screen. I'm not sure if everybody can see me or not. Samuel, I'm going to check with tech right now. See if everybody's seeing me okay, because my screen just went to tech support. Please send a private message. Is anybody else seeing me? You see me? Okay, Minga sees me on Zoom, but am I being seen on the Darwin Day website, Samuel? Do you know? We're just double checking. Okay, Samuel tells me we're live and everything's fine. Thank you. Appreciate you bearing with us in these tough times. As I mentioned, this is our 25th anniversary celebration of Sacramento Darwin Day, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the founders of Sacramento Darwin Day who had the insight 25 years ago to focus on science and the support of science and why it's so important. We still have on our committee one of the founding members, Rhonda Silva. I'd like to thank Rhonda for her 25 years of service to science and our committee and our community. She's a pleasure to work with. She handles our checkbook, which I know we all appreciate. So Rhonda, thank you again very much. Before we proceed to Dr. Naumann's presentation, we have a special guest to whom we all owe a great deal of respect. Visiting us from his home study in Down, England, is the esteemed naturalist, geologist, and biologist known for his contributions to evolutionary biology. His proposition that all species of life have descended from common ancestors is now widely accepted and considered a fundamental concept in science. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Charles Darwin. Darwin, your sound is off. I understand it's all new to you.
I'm not terribly familiar with all of this sort of thing. Unfortunately, I have someone helping me with this. So thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm very honored and pleased to be here as a part of your event today. And I would like to speak to you today about how and why I wrote about my researches. Though I'm not wont to speak of my feelings, desires, and motivations, I feel it's important to do so today because I have learned that you face a critical need to inform the common people about scientific endeavors and the need for such undertakings for the advancement of humankind. In my time, too, there was such a need, but for the first time, people were seeing all around them the fruits of scientific achievements. Technical advancements in industry, transportation, and in civil engineering were appearing at an unprecedented pace. This drove a natural curiosity about these scientific achievements, and so scientific writing was increasingly directed to satisfy this curiosity. Unlike your world, those who studied natural history published their findings for both the public and their peers in the same publications. The most profound studies were published in books for a wide distribution. I would like to focus on two of my most popular books that fell in this category. My first book, called in its latest editions, A Journal of Researches into the Natural History and Geology of the Countries Visited During the Voyage of the HMS Beagle Around the World, was a travel log describing the places, the biology and geology of the people that I observed on that voyage. The second book that I will describe writing was On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. I published the first edition of my Beagle voyage in 1839 as the third volume of a 3-volume description of the 2 voyages of the Beagle in surveys of South America. My volume proved to be the most popular, so the publisher approached me to write a new edition, which was published in that same year. The book was again very popular, so much so that 7 editions were published during my lifetime, and several more were published afterwards, including under the title Voyage of the Beagle. Travelogues were a very popular genre of literature at this time because this was at the height of the expansion of the British Empire. I sought to focus the reader on the natural history of the places I visited rather than their civic aspects, which as such as most books of this kind did. I kept the reader's attention by focusing on details of the things I saw. I find this engages the curiosity of readers to a greater extent than do exclusively broad descriptions of locales. Further, I shared with the reader my excitement as a first-time traveler at seeing and experiencing the places we visited. This drew readers into the story and allowed them to share in my excitement. I learned from this experience in writing the importance of these methods to connect with both the reader's emotions and intellects. I wrote many books after my return from that voyage, but likely my most memorable was On the Origin of Species. This book was meant to serve a different purpose than that of the Voyage of the Beagle, but it reached the same audience. I knew that I was going to provide a great deal of factual evidence to support both my theory of speciation and my theory of natural selection. I wanted to provide sufficient evidence so readers could decide as to the veracity of these theories, but I did not want them to become befuddled by the numerous facts. I wanted to lead my readers along my trail of thought regarding these ideas, so I needed to keep them interested along the way. Finally, I needed to comfort those whose long-held convictions would be disturbed by the revelations afforded by these theories. Everyone is a person of their times, and my experience of how writing was done was heavily influenced by the period of Romantic literature. Now, though it is often characterized as being inimical to the scientific view, I found that its approach to describing nature was useful. As the force of impressions generally depends on preconceived ideas, I may add that mine were taken from the vivid descriptions in the personal narrative written by the Romantic natural historian and author Alexander von Humboldt, which far exceeds in merit anything else I have read. My mode of description followed that of von Humboldt's ideal of romantic science, with all the shades of subjectivity, intuition, and poetic sense. My style of argument appealed to my readers' emotions. I used the first person at the beginning of Origin, and I then led the reader through the logic of the examination of my evidence using we. As such, my readers and I became partners in these explorations, and together were led to the same conclusions. To further welcome my readers, I began my argument with the familiar, pigeons. Pigeon breeding was very popular and a well-known example of selection by humans for desired breeds. In the first person, I told how, from my personal experience raising pigeons, desired breeds could be slowly, generation by generation, chosen or selected to yield new breeds. I was convinced that by demonstrating how human selection worked, I could then show my readers how this same process was occurring in nature, that is, natural selection. I described many small but familiar examples of variations in nature and explained how these may have been selected to survive. I chose the word selection, much to the consternation of many of my colleagues, deliberately, because I felt this analogy with human selection would convince more people that this process was clearly acting in the natural world. Of my writing, my son Francis said, "I've always felt it to be a curious fact that he who has altered the face of biological science," he was talking about me, "and in this respect the chief of the moderns, should have written and worked in so essentially a non-modern spirit and manner. In reading his books, one is reminded of the older naturalists rather than of the modern school of writers. His courteous and conciliatory tone towards his reader is remarkable. The reader feels like a friend who is being talked to by a courteous gentleman and not like a pupil being lectured to by a professor. The tone of such a book as The Origin is charming and almost pathetic. It is the tone of a man who, convinced of the truth of his own views, hardly expects to convince others. It is just the reverse of the style of a fanatic who wants to force people to believe. The reader is never scorned for any amount of doubt which he may be imagined to feel, and his skepticism is treated with patient respect. A skeptical reader, or perhaps even an unreasonable reader, seems to have been generally present to his thoughts. It was in consequence of this feeling, perhaps, that he took much trouble over points which he imagined would strike the reader or save him trouble, and so tempt him to read." I would like now to turn to a reading from the writings of my close friend, Thomas Huxley. Mr. Huxley was a strong advocate for public education in science, particularly in the biological sciences. This was part of his feeling that all men, regardless of educational level or societal status, should be aware of not only of the facts of science, but of the process of scientific investigations. He saw a purpose in this beyond the mere utilitarian applications of science, but also in the ennobling aspects of knowledge and the advancement of minds and society. And now I read from Mr. Huxley's 1876 essay on the study of biology.
I've asked people to submit questions via chat, and
I provide now an illustration of the importance of biological study. It is only through such study that men are able to form something like a rational conception of what constitutes valuable criticism of the teachings of biologists. As we now see, people not only do not seem to think it necessary to be acquainted with the grammar of the subject, but they have not even mastered the alphabet. One would almost think this to be a self-evident proposition. You find criticism and denunciation showered about by persons who not only have not attempted to go through the discipline necessary to enable them to be judges, but who have not even reached that stage of emergence from ignorance in which the knowledge that such a discipline is necessary dawns upon the mind. I have had to watch with some attention, in fact, have been favored with a good deal of it myself, the sort of criticism with which biologists and biological teachings are visited. I am told every now and then that there is a brilliant article in so-and-so in which all are demolished. I used to read these things once, but I am getting old now, and I have ceased to attend very much to this cry of wolf. When one does read any of these productions, what one generally finds on the face of it is that the brilliant critic is devoid of even the elements of biological knowledge. Now, two things must be obvious. The first place, that every man who has the interests of truth at heart must earnestly desire that every well-founded and just criticism that can be made should be made. But in the second place, it is essential to anybody's being able to benefit by criticism that the critic should know what he is talking about and be in a position to form a mental image of the facts symbolized by the words he uses. If not, such a criticism is a mere waste of time on the part of its author and wholly undeserving of attention on the part of those who are criticized. However, in the teaching of biology and other areas of natural knowledge, let us not lose sight of the benefits of such knowledge to the common welfare and advancement of men's humanity. Such knowledge is not simply provided to enhance one's power and financial gain. Natural knowledge can bring students up with kindness, and if need be, with sternness, in the way they should go, and instructing them in all things needful for their welfare. I should not venture to speak thus strongly of my justification were it not to be found in the simplest and most obvious facts. These notorious truths justify my assertion that the improvement of natural knowledge, whatever direction it has taken and however low the aims of those who may have commenced it, has not only conferred practical benefits on men, but in doing so has effected a revolution in their conceptions of the universe and of themselves, and has profoundly altered their modes of thinking and their views of right and wrong. I say that natural knowledge, in desiring to ascertain the laws of comfort, has been driven to discover those laws of conduct and to lay the foundations of a new morality. Thank you so much for your attention today. And I look forward to the coming presentations in today's events.
Thank you, Mr. Darwin. I am very grateful for your time and your insight. If you would entertain me for a moment, the Darwin Day Committee democratically selected a question for you, if you don't mind.
No, please.
If you could have met Gregor Mendel in your day, how would that have impacted your theory of evolution?
I'm glad you asked that. So I was aware of Gregor Mendel's work. As a matter of fact, I learned later that we may have come very close to meeting. He traveled to Paris and then to London to see the World's Fair in London. Unfortunately, at that time, my family was going on holiday to the coastline, so we never met one another. We may have had difficulty. He only spoke German, and I only spoke English, and so we may have trouble communicating. But I don't recall having precisely read his work. It was in some of the books that I had, summaries of them in English. But we disagreed on the importance of hybrids in evolution. He was very much convinced that hybridization was a means in which one could generate new species. And this is a very old idea. Linnaeus even mentioned this sort of idea. And so it's almost like another sort of special creation happening through hybridization. I disagreed with that idea. I didn't believe hybrids really led to new speciation because you were working with already known characters and simply mixing them together. I was really interested in the question, where did these new characters come from? And so I came up with an idea of panspermia, which didn't really get very much accepted with that. But he really thought there was something in addition to a natural selection that must be underlying evolutionary speciation. And I disagreed with that. So if we got together, I think we may have just agreed to disagree in a very gentlemanly way, but I'm not certain that we would have convinced one another. He actually was aware of all of my works. He very much read them, but he never came to the conclusions that you all came to much later on either, even though he had both of them in his mind. So neither of us did. So I'm not entirely certain we would have moved the science forward very much by meeting. Oops. I cannot hear you.
Thank you. One quick question from the audience.
Yes.
Do you think there's a possibility for a détente between those who accept the theory of evolution, obviously, and those dedicated to religion?
I believe so. It certainly happened in my time, very much, even within my own lifetime, which was a bit surprised to me. But even the established religions were accepting it by the time, but later on in my life. So I believe it is possible. It may take some great deal of convincing and patience, but I believe it is possible.
Thank you very much. It's truly a thrill to be here. Would you mind sticking around to enjoy our presentation today?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Charles Darwin, ladies and gentlemen. That was really fun. And I think we'll be doing this every year. It's so nice to have you here.
I'd love to.
Thank you. Now, before we proceed to our featured presentation, we will hear from one of our esteemed leaders, Minga Futrell, who will provide her annual presentation on the importance of this event and why science is so important to the health and well-being of our community. Before I introduce Minga, I really want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you in attendance today, and for those who have supported this year's efforts but unable to attend. This unique presentation, entirely online, will remain available for future viewing. Feel free to share it far and wide. I certainly do not need to delve too deeply into what a strange and challenging couple of years we have all endured since February of 2020. Little did we know that day that what lied ahead. A worldwide pandemic was just beginning to creep into our lives, where it has firmly entrenched itself, but is slowly losing its grip. I think we can all see the light at the end of the tunnel, but must remain vigilant to protect ourselves, our neighbors, and our world. Your support, patience, and understanding in such challenging times is greatly appreciated. Today's presentation is interactive. As you can see, the chat function is enabled, and you are welcome to comment as the event progresses. At several points in his presentation, Dr. Knowl may solicit your opinions and insight. Please participate in the chat as you see fit. I will present Dr. Knowl with some select questions from the viewers at the end of the presentation. The Sacramento Darwin Day Committee is determined to continue for the same reasons the event was founded 25 years ago. Because science is an important and endlessly interesting world that we feel deserves recognition and a forum. The committee appreciates each and every one of you and looks forward to providing another fun in-person event next year. If you are so inclined or inspired, please take a moment and click on the donate button and support the committee's efforts. Please be assured that the committee's efforts are entirely voluntary, and all donations will go towards providing this event to you, supporting science, and the speakers who join us each year. Thank you. It is now time for one of my favorite annual traditions here at Sacramento Darwin Day, the traditional call to action. Science is the key to our survival as a species, and it needs to be exalted, defended, and discussed as often as possible. Here to conduct our annual call to action is one of the founders and past chair of Sacramento Darwin Day, my friend, Minga Futrell.
Thank you very much, Pat. Delivering that action message is a role you have assigned to me each year recently. So for starters, let me simply tell everybody about a new book that you may not know about, and it's called A Natural History of the Future, and it packs between its covers so much of what we science enthusiasts really ought to consider as humankind is barreling forth full force into rapidly escalating challenges, environmental and economic. And it's kind of a fresh general public version of Ecology 101, and it offers great grounding for addressing the swiftly changing ecosystems of which all living beings are a part. So you can learn what the laws of biology are telling us about the destiny of species. So this year, I'm not going to be moaning about scientific illiteracy or anti-science attitudes or pleading for strengthening of science. No more of my dark clouds usuals. Instead, a break. I want to relish what probably has drawn all of us online here on a sunny Sunday afternoon. We gather not only to toast science for its contributions, but also to hear from our invited speaker about concussions and cognition. We want to learn something new ourselves. And so here's our chance, once again, to have a research scientist speak to us about his work, tell us what he does and how he learns, and we hope also impart a bit of love for science or for doing it. We know the tale told in books about our guest today. As a young boy, his inordinate fascination with nature and how it interfered with his schoolwork, the Latin and Greek, the bugs, you know, the beetles. And from that boy's continuing science, of course, developed this fabulous natural selection theory, considered very often the most powerful scientific theory ever developed. And it's fundamental to so many contemporary scientific enterprises all over the world. The adult level book that I mentioned before, The Natural History of the Future, hails another famous naturalist who shared Darwin's effusive love for tiny arthropods. E.O. Wilson died in December after a notably lengthy and productive career studying ants. And his story of a spindly boy who loved butterflies and snakes and sea creatures and birds and amphibians and pretty much everything that moved. It tells how, due to a childhood injury, this one-eyed scientist could see very, very small things very, very well, ants. And so his entomological studies went way beyond that boyhood and led to his eventual discovering of some of the laws of biology. Today we can hail whatever it is that drives such scientists, whether individually or collaboratively, to commit themselves, sometimes under extraordinarily difficult conditions, from hot deserts to under the ocean, up in the sky, in the lab, wherever, to exploration of things not yet known, be it through hard work in basic science or by directing their skills to solve problems by way of applied science. And the ecology book I mentioned has many examples of recent work. And despite disappointments, this past year in science has brought us so many positive science stories. And I want to highlight just a couple of delightful instances in which today's scientists are being rewarded right away for some Darwinian, Wilsonian curiosity and persistence. Take the thrill of those UK scientists who recently unearthed a 32-foot-long fossil. How meticulously the excavation team cleaned the skeleton, taking countless digital 3D photos, painstakingly digging numerous trenches, scrupulously building plaster jackets with splints, and doing everything they could to safely lift heavy but very delicate pieces out of the ground so that the initial form could be preserved for further study. And that ichthyosaurus is probably one of the greatest in the fields of British paleontology, greatest find. And here's another one. The Egyptian scientists, their delight when digitally unwrapping that 3,500-year-old mummy of the pharaoh. It was widely reported in media. The CAT scan non-invasively revealed the physical features, and the lead scientist was so excited on the NPR at discovering how surprised she was that the pharaoh's teeth were so clean. It was better than any Christmas present. And certainly we all felt a thrill of collective achievement for science as we witnessed that marvelous unfolding of the James Webb Research Telescope, thanks to years and years of plotting and planning prior to the marvelous accomplishment. So much science to celebrate. So also about the science in the crucible, the results tested by fire as we're all, the world is watching and we're all anticipating the novel vaccines and effective therapies, and the revamping of biomedical research toward unprecedented cooperation across countries, a genesis for continuing collaborative endeavor. And I'll add, in the face of climate change, we humans really have to look to science to see our way forward, to design a more resilient future for all living things, not just humanity. And oh yeah, and to tell us whether our current sports activities are damaging our thinking. So let's hear from our speaker today, what he has to tell us about what nature has revealed to him and his explorations by way of his particular methods. I'm anxious to hear, so thank you all, and back to you, Pat.
Thank you, Minga. It's always a pleasure. I really enjoy your perspective and appreciate your passion and your leadership, of course. I think your point about all species, of course, you're right. We have a responsibility, and we can do it. I know we can do it, but we've got to support and celebrate science and put it and keep it in perspective, which is it's our best way out of a lot of our issues. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's featured presenter. This year's featured speaker is Dr. Eric Knowman. Dane and Mary Louise Miller, Professor of Biomedical Engineering at University of Cincinnati. Co-founder, Advanced Regenerative Technologies, co-founder, IF Battery. The title of his presentation is Concussions and Cognition. Dr. Knowl informs me that while his degrees are in mechanical engineering, he knows almost nothing about cars. His focus has always been on biological problems. His research has led to human joint repair product currently used at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago and Walter Reed Hospital outside Washington, D.C. His work covers a wide range of assistive technologies and has been featured in numerous journals and a cover article in Sports Illustrated magazine, perhaps his proudest accomplishment. His degrees include Bachelor's of Science in Mechanical Engineering from University of Delaware, Master's in Science in Mechanical Engineering from University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include cell and tissue mechanics, human injury, adult stem cell-based tissue regeneration, biophysics, and biotransport. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the 25th anniversary of the Sacramento Darwin Day, Dr. Eric Knowl.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm proud to be here, and this is going to be fun. So if it's okay, I'll jump right into the presentation. See if pull that up on my screen here. There it is. Concussions, cognition. This is kind of a slightly different take for me, but one of the things that I wanted to point out at the very beginning, and this has been a project that we've been working on for about 13 years, and it started off with myself, Tom Talavage, and Larry Leverins kind of on a lark asking a question and realizing that we actually had the means to start going down that road and answering it. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about today pulled in a much broader collaboration. Hans Breiter and Semyon Slobunov were two of the biggest contributors, but of all the PhDs on this title slide, I have to be perfectly honest, where everything, all the creativity and all the energy and all the work is really coming from our graduate students and our undergraduate students and all the people that work with us. And I wanted to just mention that and note that up front, because I have been blessed with a tremendous group of students to work with. And then I was going to spend just a second on a little bit of my background, because it ties into the topic for today. I'm originally from northern Minnesota. So if you've seen Fargo and you've seen the accent, you're probably curious about why I don't have that accent. And the reason is we lived so far north, so far out in the country, that I only had my parents to listen to. And they weren't from Minnesota originally, but my cousins all have the accent, everybody else. But growing up in northern Minnesota, one of the first times that I realized it's just a little bit different was I failed gym class twice, which is not easy to do, but I couldn't skate. And in Minnesota, ice skating was a big part of gym class, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't figure it out. One of these things where probably no one on the Zoom call has taken an F in gym class. I'm certainly not going to ask, but we found out later that the reason why is that my joints don't all connect correctly, but I didn't know it at the time. And so I'll give you a quick demonstration. It might be a little bit triggering for people, so I'll just do a quick dislocation, show you what happens. But if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to look. But you see something like that, and then it just kind of goes back all the way and makes a right angle the wrong way. But all my joints do that. My knees do that, my ankles, my hip. I can pretty much dislocate any joint anytime. And there's lots of stories about that. But the long and the short of it is that's one of the things that got me into studying the biomechanics. What was different about me kind of set the stage for trying to figure out how biomechanics actually works. And we moved around a lot, ended up in Delaware for high school, and went to University of Delaware. That was a wonderful experience for a lot of different reasons. My wife and I then moved out to California, and as Patrick said, I went to University of California, Berkeley, and we had a wonderful time there. My first teaching gig was in New Orleans at Tulane University, and that's an interesting place. Hopefully, y'all get to go sometime. Jazz Fest is kind of the best, the sweet spot there. But I wanted to mention something here about when I went to Purdue University in 2004. It wasn't long after that I got to teach a class on the history of great ideas. And the one that we decided to do was Origin of the Species. And I wanted the students to actually read the book, because it's probably the most quoted book and the least understood, or the least actually read, right? So I didn't, maybe next to the Bible and the Quran. But that one, it was very important to me that we went through, and we went chapter by chapter. We did a chapter every week, and it was one of the most amazing experiences that we had. And seeing how all that pulled together, you get a feel for Darwin's personality through the entire thing, and his questions and his concerns about the theory. So it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. Got to do a lot of other things at Purdue as well. But the one that we're going to talk about today is head injuries. And so getting into that, the lab focuses on head injuries right now, but we do a wide range of other activities, the assistive technologies I'll talk about later at the end if there's time, and rebuilding people who get injured, which is kind of an interesting thing that takes advantage of our own biology. This is one, again, that some of you might not want to watch. This isn't called the Oklahoma drill. And this is a couple youth football players, and what they're going to do is go full speed at each other. And they're not supposed to do it this way. I'll lay that out first once you see it.
Oh my gosh.
So that's not an unusual thing, unfortunately, for these kinds of practices. And the coaches made a lot of mistakes. The coaches are just parents out there trying to get their kids involved in sports. And they're not supposed to go full speed. They're not supposed to put their heads down like that. There's all kinds of mistakes that are made. But ultimately, we saw that kind of event, and we thought, well, why is one kid concussed and the other one walks away from it? And that was kind of the foundation for our original question that Tom and Larry and I put forth. Tom's an expert in neuroimaging with the MRI. Larry is a clinician, and I do the biomechanics, and I study, how people injure themselves, how people break. And so the team was actually really well suited to this question. Ultimately, what we found out was that people didn't really understand traumatic brain injury at all. And we needed to reassess and redefine how we talk about things. And so I think that's kind of an important feature, especially when we think about it in terms of how Darwin had to define these concepts really carefully. And so when you see this sport, the sport as a laboratory, you see Mike Webster, Andre Waters, Dave Duerson, Junior Seau, and all the other stories of people that were affected by brain trauma and didn't realize they were experiencing it. And it's a very insidious kind of injury, because the more you are affected by it, probably the less you're aware of it in many respects. And what happened was with Mike Webster, when Mike Webster passed, Bennett Amalu was there, Dr. Amalu was there to examine the tissue and do the autopsy. And normally you probably wouldn't section the brain, you wouldn't study the brain in an autopsy like that, but there had been such bizarre behavior, And as soon as you looked at him, you realized that he was gluing his teeth back in, and he was doing all kinds of really extreme things to survive. He had marks all over him for he would tase himself to go to sleep. And so Dr. Malu decided to look at his brain and see what was going on. And he found the CTE, and then he found it in other players. And people started to become aware of what was going on over time. And he and Julian Bales were tremendous. We got to work with them later on. It was an honor. And then Ann McKee and the rest of the group at Boston kind of took things even further and created a center that was there to study CTE. And I'm kind of curious. I assume everybody out there has either had a concussion or knows somebody close to them that has had a concussion. And the symptoms can vary quite a bit. So there's things like sensitivity to light. You might lose consciousness. You might have a metallic taste in your mouth. One of the most dangerous ones people don't usually know about is if your hands and feet start to itch, without any reason for that. That is a very dangerous sign. We actually interacted with an athlete who had experienced that, and your sense of touch is so hardwired in your brain that if you're getting the wrong signals, if you're interpreting the wrong signals from your sense of touch, that means something has really, really gone wrong. And so what's interesting is as we looked at the definitions of concussion, we found that just the definition varied tremendously. And at that time, when we were first looking around in the military, it was generally common practice that you weren't diagnosed with a concussion unless you were unconscious for at least 30 minutes. Most of us would call that a short coma. That's a big difference than what most of us would consider a concussion. But we look at it as anything that changes your perception or your interaction with the world, anything that affects your neurology substantially has to go in as a concussion. And so what we did, and I have to say, I appreciate Tom and Larry for just kind of having the audacity to try this experiment, because we started off, we were supposed to work with the Purdue football team, but at the last minute they decided they didn't feel like it would be a good situation with a brand new coach and all kinds of protocols. So we started working with a local high school, and they were wonderful. And we've had so much support from the community. It is just tremendous. But we started out by giving them all MRIs, and not just the kind that most people get, where you get an image of your shoulder, an image of your knee. Tom was able to look at the function of the brain, the structure of the brain, and the brain chemistry using the MRI. So we did all that up front. Then my team tracked every single hit that the players took in practices and games, quantified them as best as possible, counted them, looked at all the different aspects of how people were hitting. And then we gave them MRIs throughout the season and then at the end of the season. And it's a tremendous undertaking. You see there, 13 years, 9 teams, middle school through college, over 500 subjects, at least 2,000 MRI scans that we've done. I'll give you my financial disclosure later on, but I can tell you now, the money that we've brought in didn't come close to paying for all these MRIs. We kind of, Tom was running the MRI facility, so when money ran out, we just kept running it. Yeah, it stays on 24/7, so we figured we'll just keep using it. I probably shouldn't have said that to everybody, but that's okay. It's all good. Now, this is what I want you to see. This is one of the early findings that we had in the first year or two. We were starting to see, this is the preseason MRI that you see here on the screen. And what you're going to see next is the MRI that we got later on in the season, about 2/3 of the way through the season. And these are night and day, absolutely night and day different. Essentially, from my perspective, what I see in these images is essentially they're doing a very simple task inside the MRI. And we're watching where blood flows in their brain, and their brain is still, they're accomplishing the task that they're meant to do, but their brain has rewired itself to accomplish that task because they've taken so much injury. And again, you look at this and you say, okay, those are clearly different. They're absolutely different, but only one of those athletes was diagnosed with concussion. The other one was never diagnosed because he didn't have an obvious symptom. He didn't get knocked out. He wasn't slurring his words. He wasn't fainting. He wasn't doing any of those kinds of things that are obvious signs of concussion. He was able to hide whatever symptoms he had. And this is where actually the science intersects with the politics and the economics, because this slide was presented to the NCAA. And we said, look, the important thing here is that we're doing these preseason scans so we can see how much people are changing. And at the time, the NCAA was funding research, but not allowing preseason baselines. And the Department of Defense wasn't allowing preseason baselines either. And we said, look, if you just look at a concussed player and somebody you think is not concussed, they're going to look pretty similar. And you're going to assume that head impacts don't count for much. But if you have the preseason and you can then look at all the changes that are happening, you start to see what's actually going on. You start to do real science on this problem. And unfortunately, they said, thank you very much, we're moving on. And so you can kind of get a sense for how things were evolving at the time. Sorry, probably a bad choice of words there, but the situation was changing for us. This is our Sports Illustrated cover. The story was on the cover, not us, obviously. We're not as interesting, but that's what you see right behind me here. That was amazing. We got a cover story, and we were able to tell the world kind of what was happening to these athletes. And again, the high school was wonderful. They let us take pictures, do everything. It was tremendous. And we said, okay, things are changing. The sport is dangerous. We have to do better. And so then we started quantifying things. This is somebody whose brain didn't change very much and was never diagnosed with concussion, never had any meaningful problems. What we did here is we tracked every hit that they took, and then we kind of unwrapped their helmet and laid it flat like you would a Mercator projection of the Earth. And all those dots show you where the hits were being taken. So when, they tend to be towards the front, but they have a lot of the small blue colored hits on the sides. This guy didn't have any real red, really massive hits that would come out red in this image. What's interesting is that when you look at, see if I did, there we go. This is somebody who was not diagnosed with a concussion, but whose brain changed dramatically. You can see the preseason to in-season difference right there. Again, you don't even need statistics to say that person is different. And what you see here is a massive collection of hits right on the front of the head. This player was using his head as a weapon, and was trying to use his head to intimidate or injure the other players. And it's incredible. It's incredible to see this. When we just printed this out and put it on this giant table. Giant tables are actually one of the most scientifically important tools that we have, because we just lay everything out and we look at it and we organize it, and then 10 minutes later we said we know what's happening. These players were taking, I think this one took well over 2,000 blows to the head over the course of the season. And one of the doctors asked us how many hits they were taking per week, and we said, well, about 200. And he said, no, I didn't mean the season. How many for the week? And we said 200. It's a 10-week season. He's going to end up with about 2,000 blows to the head. And the doctor was stunned. And so these are the kind of numbers and things that we had to put out there just so people would understand what was actually happening. This is something that I thought was kind of interesting as well, because we're getting to the point where we're pushing the limits of what the MRI can do. And what this is kind of a nodal analysis. What you're looking at is the quantification of the representation of us putting somebody in an MRI and saying, don't go to sleep, but let your brain free associate. Free association is one of the most important things that humans do. It allows them to be creative. It allows you to think of different ideas. Go from this point to this point to this point, and you kind of make all these random connections. But this is actually watching the random connections happen. So the green dot near the bottom was kind of our starting point. And then essentially what happened is every time there was blood flow there was blood flow in one of those other spots right after. You could actually watch the free association, what is called the resting state. And so in these control athletes, these are like runners and basketball players and swimmers, except for the backstrokers. Sometimes the backstrokers hit their head on the wall, and we don't, that's no judgment. It's just, one of those things that happens. And the controls tend to have somewhere between 63 and 70 of these connections. So we looked at our football players then, and what we found was that, there it is, that upper left, that's the preseason. You had over 100 connections being made. In the preseason, before any practices had started, these athletes were free associating more than their control counterparts. And we looked at that and we thought that, that's a 50% increase. That's ridiculous. What's going on? And it didn't really occur to us that they were really that much more creative or that much more able to create new ideas. But essentially, their brain is making a bunch more connections. They're weaker connections. They take a lot more energy, but they need those connections because as you look across the top, as you go through the season, that number crashes. So when they go through 2-a-days, the number goes way down. And then when you go out through the season, it comes back to about 70, 75, 80. And what's interesting about that is that it seems like their brain is adapting to all the impacts that they're taking. Then that bottom middle is right before the playoff, or right during the playoffs, actually. And so during the playoffs, everybody gets really serious. They start hitting really hard and they plummet again. And then a month or two after the season, that bottom right, the number goes back up. I think it's about 88, 86, 88. And they start to rebuild those connections, but they're adapting. And so different than evolving, obviously. So what's happening there is they are, season after season, their brain has realized that it physiologically it needs more connections because some of them are going to go away 1 or 2 times during the season. And this was one of the most amazing and honestly damning results that we found. We saw this and we realized that there were massive changes going on here. Without those preseason data, we never would have known. We never would have understood how this is happening, but these athletes are changing season to season. So we wanted to understand that a little bit better and try to figure out what was going on. So we started looking at the structure. And this is a chart that we made. We spent a long time on this, and I'm not sure if we really did it justice, but those dashed lines at the bottom are what happened when you take somebody and you put them in the MRI, and then you put them in the MRI a few weeks later, do it again, and you just kind of compare those images. So the change in the white matter is going to be a few percent, just because there's variability from one scan to the next. But each one of those circles is what we saw preseason to postseason. White matter changes. So the white matter is the part of your brain that holds the neurons, right? The neurons and the myelinating fibers and all those structures that allow the neurons to conduct information. So we were seeing, 10% difference in many of the athletes, and where the blue circle is vertically tells you what percentage of the white matter has changed. The size of the circle tells you how many hits they took relatively. So you see one that's up there, kind of like 13, 14%. The green line is an athlete who was in a massive car accident, who we just happened to have a pre-accident and a post-accident image on. massive head trauma, somebody that they weren't sure was going to make it. And yeah, he had a big change in the white matter structure of his brain, but some of the other players had more, and or as much. And that was very interesting. That's very, very alarming, I would say. It's not typical to be in the lab, be doing work like this, and then come back and say, this is crazy, right? Like we have to be careful here. So that was something that told us, okay, we've got to make some changes. We've got to figure out what's going on. And the details of this slide aren't as important as the idea. The idea is, what kind of threshold are we looking for? So we looked at players that were not diagnosed with concussion, who had these changes. The previous slide, nobody was actually diagnosed with concussion except the car accident victim. These are just changes that are happening, and people think everything is fine. So what we did is we looked at a bunch of these players. This slide is for the soccer players, I believe, and then the next one is for the football players. We wanted to see, is there a threshold at which the brain starts to not be able to keep up with the damage, right? So it makes sense that you might be able to take a little bit of damage. Our ancestors, were rough and tumble. And so you've got to be able to absorb a little bit of damage. And so what we found that was very interesting was that in the soccer players, the threshold's about 50 Gs. Once you get a hit above 50 Gs, your body can't keep up with the repair process. And then we did it in football, and we found the same thing. So football and women's soccer showed the exact same threshold, right around 50 Gs. And that has very important implications. One is it kind of tells us what kind of range is relatively safe, what kind of range have we evolved to be able to handle in the normal course of events, and at what point do you go past that? And once you go past that, that gives me as a mechanical engineer a design criteria. Now I guarantee you I can design a helmet that will keep all the hits below 50 Gs. But before we had that threshold, we didn't know how good the helmet had to be. And our line was, well, any idiot can make a better helmet. We just didn't know when it was good enough. Now we have the threshold. Now we know when the helmets are good enough. And then the question became genetics. Do genetics play a role? And this was very interesting. We got into this with Sam Slobanov and Hans Breiter, two amazing researchers, people asking really hard questions. And Sam was at Penn State, is at Penn State, and he was working with a football team there, and he actually got to take some blood samples. And we looked at how different proteins were changing. We looked at some of the genetic factors. We looked at all kinds of things. And one of the things that we found was that the KIAA 0319 gene seemed to be very highly correlated with the number of concussions that the players had had. And mutations to that particular gene show up as being very as being indicative of whether or not you're going to have a history of concussions. And that was very, very unexpected. Because to be honest, from a mechanical engineering perspective, I thought it was all the head impacts. Stop hitting your head and you stop having brain problems. But it turns out that there was a genetic component to it. And what's interesting, the KIAA 0319 gene is associated with dyslexia. So you can have a mutation to this and you might not get dyslexia. You might not experience dyslexia, but if you have dyslexia, you almost certainly have a mutation to this gene, almost 100%. And so it turns out that in addition to people with dyslexia being typically more creative, more able to appreciate kind of the random jumps between ideas that might occur, it turns out that they might also have a neuroprotective characteristic. Essentially what happens is the tissue skeleton, the soft tissue skeleton that holds the brain intact, is usually aligned with the neurons. But if you have this mutation, what typically happens is the soft tissue skeleton is perpendicular. It's 90 degrees out of phase with the neurons. And so when you take an impact and the soft tissue skeleton stretches or deforms or transmits that energy, the neurons in the case of dyslexia, those with dyslexia, their neurons don't experience those changes, those energy transfers that are causing all these problems. And so we thought this was just amazing. This is one of the things that we just had the results. This was published fairly recently, and we're pushing hard here at University of Cincinnati to try to figure out how these things all tie together. Because based on our early reading here, it looks like, the genetics might be, 30, 40% of the story just in the case of this one gene. So there's a lot of things for us to look at and try to understand better. But this was one that jumped out at us and was just phenomenal, amazing. As we go further, hit that again. Oh, there we go. We have two options here. So we can prevent the injury or we can try to repair the damage. We've had a lot of success, my students and I, with repairing damage to the skeleton, bones, tendons, ligaments, cartilage. That's fine. We can repair that damage. Repairing damage to the brain is much less successful. Not something that you want to make a plan A. So we got into it. We thought, well, probably preventing the injury is the best way to go. So we started down that path. Let's see if I can. There we go. And we actually designed a helmet, a double shell helmet. And I had a wonderfully talented student design new padding material. And then I made that helmet, that double shell helmet in the garage, literally in the garage. And we put it together. We put it on Dr. Tlavage, and we started hitting it, just see what happened. And that was not such a, that sounds bad when I say it that way. I had been the guinea pig for the soccer headers. And so I tapped out at around 50 Gs. So he took a couple blows, and it's amazing because with the double shell helmet, you keep the impacts away from you. The most of the energy gets absorbed between the first shell and the second shell. And so the data that we were getting was tremendous. The material that we put in there, just the material alone took a military helmet from, I think it was 400 Gs down to 186 Gs. So the fact that you can absorb this energy, it's right there. The technology is right there. The materials that we made this out of are not fancy nanomaterials. It's basically silicone. The padding probably costs $3 a helmet. And so those kind of things were very encouraging, very heartening. And again, I have to give thanks to the students that really pushed these ideas and tried these things out. We then actually took them to, one of the nice things that you could do at Purdue is you could blow things up, right? So one of the advantages of being in the Midwest with lots of space, they let you blow things up. And so, it's different. Can't pull that off at University of Cincinnati, but we got the data. So this was interesting because that red line you see is the shock wave when it's just allowed to go right through, and you can see how steep that is. And then when we put our material in there, the light blue there, we still saw a shock wave, but it was reduced. And then when we mixed our material with vegetable oil, we eliminated the shock wave altogether. And so what we had created was essentially the cheapest possible way to mitigate shock waves, essentially from explosions, right? So we felt like we had understood something about head injury from looking at athletics and created something that had use in the military and would protect people, right? So that was one of those stages in my career where I thought, we've done something great, right? And so that's a hard feeling to replicate. It was really amazing. Since then, we've had to go past that, right? So when I taught my class on Darwin, the final project was for students to look at how other things have evolved, how healthcare has evolved, how the auto industry has evolved, all these different kind of things, which don't, the terminology might not be quite right, but it was interesting how many of Darwin's ideas kind of held in some of these other arenas. And our thinking has evolved in many respects. We're now making these computer models of each individual that we work with. And the first time we did it, it took 6 months to go from a CT scan to a model, a computer model. Now we can do it in about an hour. And so now we can study the whole team. We can understand everything that's happening to them and how this damage is actually propagating through the brain. I wanted to give my funding disclosure here, just so you can see where we've brought money in. It's about 1.6 million over 13 years. We haven't been allowed to access any of the funds from the NCAA or Department of Defense, really, except for that last one. They've spent about 100 million. But like I said, without the baselines, without the preseason, knowing what the person's brain looks like, it's very hard to tell what's happening. It's very hard to make a reasoned scientific conclusion without having that baseline data. And so I just wanted to shout that out here, because just in the couple minutes that we have left, I wanted to show how, and this may be a stretch in some sense, but I wanted you to see how work that we did in one area jumped into another area, or loosely speaking, how our work in one area evolved into providing something for another. So this one was, when we were at Purdue, there was our center was about 7'2", 7'3", Isaac Haas, big guy, huge. You look at him, you think you're going to look him in the eye, and then you look up, and then you look up again, and then you look up a third time, and then you're looking him in the eye. Like, it's just, you're not used to that kind of height. He's a big guy. And he broke his elbow in the NCAA tournament, and they wouldn't let him play because the brace that he had was too big and too much metal, and he thought they might hurt some people. So they tasked us, they gave us 34 hours to make a brace that the NCAA would approve. And so you can imagine my students were beyond excited. And they did it. They used the padding material we had from the helmets. One of the students in the lab was very good at leather work. And so that became very useful. We did some composites, some carbon fiber composites, and we were able to make a brace that you can see him wearing there. And that got a lot of play. That was in the tournament. The announcers were talking about it. We were watching all my whole lab. We got together, we watched the game. It was wonderful. Exactly what you hope for as an advisor. And then what we did, or what happened that was kind of interesting, was that a Purdue alum was watching and saw this and asked us to help out because their spouse was a music teacher in Texas, actually. And this little girl wanted to play the violin. Uretzi wanted to play the violin. And so, but she couldn't for fairly obvious reasons. And so we were able to get her a violin and a prosthetic. And this is, I think, the first generation. We had a second, third generation prosthetic. And it was wonderful experience. The students got as excited about this process as they did about the basketball player. And unfortunately, she's so far away, it was difficult to go back and forth. 34 hours definitely wasn't enough to figure that out. But we got it to her. Unfortunately, her family, they were immigrants to the United States. They had to move. Very suddenly, they were in a different school system. We lost track of her. But it was such a positive experience to be able to take what we had done for sports and do something for a little girl who needed an assistive technology, right? Like that was a win in anyone's book. And I just wanted to show two other things here. This was this is something that evolved over about 17, 18 years. This is us rebuilding tendons and ligaments. And the reason that I showed this one is that in Darwin's book on Origin of the Species, he kind of threatens to write a book just on pigeons, just the whole thing on pigeons. And to my knowledge, that book never got written. I think that was one that was still in draft form, but I have almost as many stories about working with sheep, and have threatened my students that we might have to write a book about sheep. But what we were able to do here, and Daryl Dickerson was the student that took the lead on this. He is amazing, and was able to rebuild the attachment between bone and tendon and bone and cartilage and all these different things. And so that's the product that's now being used at Rush Hospital and Walter Reed. And the last thing seems very, very left field, but I just wanted to show that the kind of stuff that we're doing and trying to understand what happens to the biology, like how do the stem cells rebuild the tendon? How do we understand the transport that occurs? It turns out that the same equations that govern nutrient transport to cells, to the adult stem cells that regrow the bone and regrow the cartilage, are the same ones that we used to power our alternative energy system that creates hydrogen electricity and uses aluminum as the foundation. And what was great about that is we figured out how to get tremendous amounts of energy out of this. And this is us driving our car. The first instance of it, we drove a little golf cart around using this system. Apple actually pioneered a method where you can take aluminum, the aluminum precursors, and turn it back into solid aluminum without generating any carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide. And so the full circle is now essentially a clean energy system. But like I said, the equations are all the same. And it's this kind of free association, this jumping back and forth that makes us human, that allowed us to do all these different things. And if it's okay, I'll leave it there. And I don't know if we have time for questions. I feel like I might have gone a little over time. I apologize, but I get excited and sometimes I just go. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Knollman. I appreciate it. No, you didn't go long at all. It was extremely interesting. Thank you very much. We do have time for questions if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Great. I have some questions from the viewers. One question was, did you research woodpeckers and why they don't get concussions?
We have looked at woodpeckers. That is a great question. It turns out there's actually some papers that suggest they do get concussions. They have a lot of the same proteins in their blood that we see in athletes after head injuries. But what is interesting about the woodpecker is that when they're actually hitting the wood, their tongue wraps around their brain and provides an extra layer of insulation or protection. And that's essentially one of the things that gave us the idea for that double shell helmet. And, because you can't really ask a person to, I don't even know how a human would pull something like that off, but yeah, so that's actually is tied in there. And I should have mentioned that because the woodpeckers are amazing. The bighorn sheep are a little scary. That one I don't understand, to be perfectly honest.
They don't look very bright.
No.
I have a question from Dr. Andrea Say. Does Dr. Knollman make devices to protect a knee joint after ACL repair so a player can safely return to sport play?
Oh, another excellent question. That is tough. We have worked on that, and protecting the ACL and letting people go back quicker, because an ACL repair typically doesn't get to full strength until you get to about 9 or 12 months. And so we worked for a long time on braces. The challenge was that if you prevent one type of motion, you kind of put them at risk for a different type of injury. And so we couldn't come up with a brace that really did a good job of protecting the ACL without damaging the rest of it. But the reason that it takes so long for the ACL to heal is that you put the graft in, and then the graft has to die and get rebuilt with the patient's own cells. And so that takes a lot of time. And so with our product, essentially you can do that in half the time, because it starts out without that dense tissue that has to die. You put ours in, the stem cells come in, and we actually saw complete and total repair in about 4 months in our sheep model, and we're pretty sure that we can get that down to 3 months. So from that perspective, our hope is that you actually don't need a brace to go back and play in a reasonable amount of time.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to last question from me and our audience. The NFL is a big business. The military is a big business. Are you receiving professional pushback? Obviously, funding is always hard to find, but I mean, do you find like aggressive countermeasures to debunk your findings?
Yes, we have had that. We usually get that in meetings and things, and you know, when we presented to the NCAA, we presented our results and said, you don't have to fund us, but you at least have to start doing these baseline scans. That's when we got some really nasty pushback from the researchers they had funded. They'd go to conferences and say mean things and publish mean things too. But the most amazing one that we got was Tom and I, Dr. Tlavage and I were at a table. We were having a conference call with somebody who was the lead clinician for the NFL at the time. And we had decided, look, we're not making any money. We're not trying to license any of this stuff. We're just telling you, you got to fix this problem. So we told him every idea that we had, and he helped start the company Vices, makes new helmets. And at the end of the call, he said, thank you very much. Just so you know, the NFL has noticed you at the executive level. And he hung up. And or his phone was hung up. We aren't quite sure exactly how. So Tom and I stared at each other for a few minutes and thought, this was right when the concussion movie was coming out. And there's a scene in there that suggests that there was some nefarious things going on. We did not know how to interpret that. We were told verbally that the NFL said we are not allowed to have any of the money that was coming through the different pathways. I don't have it in writing, but I have it from some very reliable sources. So we did get a lot of pushback. That's part of why I put that funding disclosure there, because we've published a tremendous amount, learned a tremendous amount, graduated some wonderful students, but for about 1% of the funding that the rest of the community has received. And so I'm proud of it, actually, in many ways.
You should be. Last question from the audience. After what you've learned about concussions in football, would you allow your son to play football? Would you attend an NFL or college football game?
Excellent question. Well, it turns out, my answer is not going to seem fair at first, because my son inherited my genetic defect. So if he were to get tackled, it would be just like when his grandfather and great-grandfather played football, and their knees would go 90 degrees. You know, like they would just, you know, the crash test dummy is what it looks like when you get tackled. So playing football was not really an option for him. My daughter did not inherit that, and she was pretty set on being a quarterback for a while. Eventually went, you know, kind of a different path, and, you know, the whole like practicing wasn't really her thing there. I have gone to a couple football games, but mostly to study, you know, mostly to see what's going on, try to understand what's happening up close. I don't necessarily boycott I don't boycott the college football games at all, mainly because a lot of those players are there because they get scholarships. And, you know, you get into this, it's a very challenging financial situation, right? Like So, I haven't taken that type of a principled stand, but I know we can make the sport better. It can be done in just a year or two if we have the right resources, and we don't have to worry about this anymore. So that's kind of been my take on it, is try to understand what's happening and fix it. So I don't know if that answers that question quite right, but
I think it's fair. You enjoy football, I think.
yeah, no, absolutely.
And you'd like to fix it.
The part of football that is wonderful is that each play is a 6-second chess match. And, when you start to analyze what happens on each play, it is ridiculous. What I don't think needs to be there is the brutality, right? So the chess match, great. High-speed chess, awesome. The injuries don't need to be there, though.
I think that's an optimistic approach, and I embrace that as well. Your presentation today has been enlightening and informative, but now in a meeting of minds that can only happen at the Sacramento Darwin Day event, I'd like to ask Mr. Charles Darwin to join us to ask you a question or two. Are you ready?
I have no idea.
You can hear me?
Yes.
All right. It was a very good presentation. Some of it was a little beyond my time, but I think I understood most of it. One question comes to mind is there a particular part of the human brain that's most sensitive to concussion? And if so, has that part of the brain in some way been specially protected through evolution, such that over time, humans have evolved to protect that part because it's most vulnerable?
Yes, I think, I believe so. So what happened when we first noticed that we were seeing huge changes in the function of the brain, but no symptoms, which was very, very strange result. Most of that change, or that most of that injury, was happening in the visual processing part of the brain, which is most of the posterior part of your brain. And what we realized, because these athletes could still see, they could still, process images, that kind of thing. What we realized was happening was that the brain actually has evolved 4 or 5 different pathways for every function that the vision processing center has to do. So you could knock out 2, 3, or 4 of them, and you can still function. And I thought that was kind of an amazing thing, because from an evolutionary perspective, the evolution of the eye is amazing, but the evolution of the processing, the part of the brain that processes what the eye brings in, is equally amazing. And so having all those redundant pathways seems to actually be something that is important. If you didn't have those, I think, especially early humans would have had a lot of trouble.
It'd be interesting to see how those pathways operate in other animals, to see how this has come about.
Absolutely.
Another question comes to mind. Now, this involves, you talked about genes and such, and someone had to explain to me what those are. But there was a gene for a particular condition called dyslexia. And so it seems though that would be a condition that would be selected against. But perhaps it remains in the human population for precisely the reason you pointed out, that it seems to provide some protection for what you're doing.
I think that's right. And I have to say that reading your book, I'm pretty sure you had an idea of genes and DNA, but maybe not the technology to actually, put a finger on it. But
that's very kind of you.
But yes, I think what we're finding is that things like dyslexia, they knew for a long time that people with dyslexia were hyper creative and able to, interpret spoken word at a different level than most people. But what was interesting here is that when you actually find out that there's a neuroprotective effect, it means that, dyslexia might have actually been very, very important for the survival of the species. That combination of creativity and the ability to take a few impacts made those people, I think, much more daring and adventurous and able to take chances that the rest of us might not be able to do.
Again, it brings to mind, I wonder if there are any analogs in the animal world for that sort of structure in the white matter that you were talking about. That may be the common way in other brains.
It might be, and it's something that we desperately want to find out. And I think there's a ton of different directions we can take this. But yeah, thank you.
Another
Thank you,
another
Mr.
line
Darwin.
of funding for you.
Yes.
I bet you were impressed with those funding numbers, Mr. Darwin.
I have to translate them into pounds and then pounds in my time.
Yes. Dr. Knollman, did you have any question for Mr. Darwin? I don't know if you ever thought you'd have an opportunity like this, so I thought I'd give you a chance.
Yeah, I did not. One of the questions that I'm very curious about is that they've done reenactments of your life, movies, in fact. I'm very curious how your wife appreciaed your work, because I believe she was very religious, but was also somebody whose opinion you valued quite a lot.
Oh yes, I valued her opinion quite a bit, as a matter of fact. I think her reaction to my work has been somewhat overstated or misunderstood. My wife, although both of us attended, at least myself for some time, the Church of England, we were both Unitarians. And so her concept of religion is not what you find in many people today. So, for example, the idea of me going to hell or that sort of thing, we didn't believe in that sort of thing. So she just thought there would perhaps be a time that we would not be together forever. And so that's really underlying some of her fears about what I was doing. But more what she was worried is that I would lose my kindness, my thoughts of other people during my life, because I would lose the reason for those. And I never did that. So I think that satisfied her in many ways. So that's really what her concern was more about.
That is fascinating.
Interesting.
So I think that's kind of support, and I know from myself, family support is tremendous. Like it's tremendously important.
My family was extraordinarily important. My children helped me in some of my experiments. We had some delightful times.
Mine too.
Running around and looking at bees and tracing them, and they're helping me with my earthworms, all manner of things.
My children and my niece actually helped me put sensors on these players, and it's quite an experience for.
It's very, very important.
Fascinating. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I'm glad I brought you together, and I know we're all better for it. This has been a fascinating afternoon of science and insight and community and camaraderie, and that's what Darwin Day is all about. So, again, thank you, Dr. Knollman. Thank you, Mr. Darwin. I really am very grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Proud to be here.
Thank you very much to everyone joining us today for the 25th Annual Sacramento Darwin Day celebration. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the Sacramento Darwin Day Organizing Committee is composed of a group of dedicated and passionate volunteers focused on promoting and supporting science in the greater Sacramento area. Each year, the group seeks out exciting and compelling speakers, and I am so proud to have helped bring Dr. Knollman here today. Thank you to our Charles Darwin presenter, Dr. Kenneth Knowl. I've pulled back the screen. That is, Dr. Kenneth Knowl is a retired professor of microbiology at the University of Connecticut. He has been portraying Charles Darwin for many years as a relatable man in presentations about his personal life, family, scientific activities, and his times. If you're interested in working with Dr. Knowl, feel free to reach out to myself or anybody in the Darwin Committee, because I know there's a lot of educators here. And as you can see, he's a very informed and talented presenter. And I'm really thrilled with having him here today, and I think we'll make it an annual event. If you don't mind, Dr. Knowl. I think you fit in perfectly, if you don't mind. Before we close, I'd like to encourage each of you to think about how you can support this fun and important event. Perhaps you can help us meet some of our operational goals and objectives by volunteering your services. Special thanks to the kitchen crew and the setup crew who make the event so fun every year. We have been virtual the last 2 years, so we haven't seen our beautiful kitchen crew. We usually have birthday cake and refreshments, and a couple hundred people all get together for this event. So we'll be back doing that next year, I'm sure. So again, thank you to our kitchen crew and all our volunteers over the years. We love you and can't wait to work with you next year. Many of you have already utilized the donate button. It's been very active. I'd like to thank you all personally for helping support us. If you would like, please press and donate now. Many of you have invited people and turned them on to what we were doing. This is the best way for our event to grow, and I encourage each of you to find a friend and invite them next year. It is my stated goal as the chairman of the Sacramento Darwin Day to not only try and produce a top-notch annual event, but to lead the event toward the future. This means an increased focus on diversity and inclusion. It is our stated goal to make all science enthusiasts aware of our event and to make them all feel welcome. If you have any ideas as to how we can continue to pursue these goals, we're all ears. It has been a challenging couple of years, and I'm sure new challenges will present themselves. The way forward for the world can be found in the roots of this community here today. By working together, supporting and following the science, we can ensure the very best outcome for ourselves and our descendants and the whole natural world. Thank you again. My name's Patrick Desmond. Sacramento Darwin Day is very near and dear to my heart, and so is everyone that's participated. Thank you, Nicholas, for your generous donation. Stuart Miller, Dr. Say, there's been a lot of donations, and I'm very grateful. And again, thank you to everybody on the committee, to Dr. Nauman. Thank you, and we'll see you next year.